Hi guys, and welcome to another Brushmaster video. Today we're going to look at two ways of blending, and I'm going to do it on this model here, which is an ogre model. I think it was from Loot Studio, and I'm just base coating it now in a mix of violet red with a little bit of amethyst blue in it. What we're going to discuss today is there's many ways to blend paint on a model, and I've got two ways here I want to show you, and they're known methods of blending, but I call them additive and subtractive ways of blending, and you're going to see what I mean as we go along here. So we're going to do two sections of this model side by side, and I'm going to blend them the two different ways to show you how it works and try and explain the pros and cons of each method. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add our first highlight over top of this base coat, and I'm just going to use saddle brown to rough in some quite blocky highlights where I'm going to want them to be. And you're going to notice here that I put these highlights on with quite thick paint because I want them to be quite bold, because I want you to be able to see the actual blending. Now we're just going to do this bottom leg here. We're going to do this in the additive method. And I'm going to do the upper left hand side of the chest with the subtractive method. They're called different names by different people, but you'll see what I mean when I start doing them. This is just how I see these two methods and how they work for me. So guys, when we first add a highlight, we basically end up with something like this. So we've got our colour, which is the dark purpley colour, or dark pink, and the light pink represents our highlight. So when we do the additive method, what's going to happen is, this is what they call sketch and glaze sometimes. So we're going to add the highlight as a quite blocky highlight, and then I'm going to mix the highlight colour down into a glaze, and then I'm going to pull that glaze into the highlight. Now what this will do, it will spread the highlight out, it'll make it bigger. So this is why I call it the sort of additive method. So when we glaze from outside, we're adding that colour of paint to a larger area, but we're pulling it into the highlight to cause the blurring and the fuzziness around the edge of the highlight which gives us our blend. So we're going to mix up a glaze out of that original highlight colour, which is saddle brown. And when I mix this up, it's sort of 1-to-1, maybe a little bit more water than paint, but I'll show you here on my thumbnail. This is how much I'm actually using to do the blend. And as you can see, that there is paint on there, but it's very thin and it's very translucent, which is what gives us our soft edges when we do the blend. Now the key to blending something like this is you load the paint, as it's in here, and then I unload it on a paper towel. Now what this does, it takes most of the paint and water off the brush, so that when you apply the glaze, it applies very thinly. And that's what we want to do with this method. We want to apply it very thinly, and we keep going over it layer after layer until we get the transition we want. Now it's important to wait each time for the layer to dry. And if you've got the brush wicked correctly on the paper towel, then each glaze should dry pretty quickly. So you can go around an area and do little sections and then go back to the previous section quite quickly. But what you'll see here is after a certain amount of passes, you suddenly see the edge of that transition line start to disappear. It starts to blur and create the transition we want. Now when you're doing this sort of method, people quite often say, how many layers do you do? And that it's really dependent on how dilute or how thick you have your paint. You can do this with slightly thicker paint and do it quicker, but you then run the risk of getting brush marks and track marks from the paint you're applying, and then you'd have to just glaze again with the underlying colour. It's really one of those things that it varies per paint as well. Some paint blends very easily, very quickly, and some paints don't. It also depends on how big a step you do. So if you do sort of what I would call reasonably logically steps, so where the highlight colour is only a medium to short step away from the base colour, then it'll blend easier because the value difference is not so great. If you do a much higher step, which you can do, it'll just take more and more glazes to smooth it out. And you probably have to do thinner glazes that way because the highlight colour will show against the underlying colour. So we're almost at the end of the first stage of glazing, and as you can see, it's quite smooth now. The transition between the violet red and the saddle brown is actually smooth, but as you can see, the highlight has spread out. It's now much bigger and much wider. So if you're going to use this method, it's quite important to make the highlights smaller. To the second method now. So I'm going to use the diagram I had before to show you a base colour and a highlight. What we do with the subtractive method or the flame on method is we mix a 50-50 colour that's right in between the two shades that we've used, so between the base colour and the highlight. And we're going to use little lines, cross hatching, little strokes to paint along the edge of the highlight. Now we're going to paint on the edge, inside the highlight and outside the highlight with sort of different strokes and different amounts of paint, and this is going to cause the blurring of the edge of the highlight. And as you can see from the diagram here, I'm sorry it's a bit crude, but this is what you'll effectively get is the highlight will shrink and you'll get this third tone that is in between the two, which is used to create that sort of fuzzy blend in between the two. So as you can see here, I've got saddle brown and my violet red. So I'm mixing those in a 50-50 proportion here. So I'm making a little pool of paint in the center, and I want this roughly halfway between the two. That's the way I usually find it works best. Try and get it as close to 50-50 as possible. And I add just a little tiny bit of water to that. Now, when I paint this on, the technique and method is very different. As you can see here, these are the colors we are going to transition from. So that's our transition color. That's the saddle brown. This is the red violet. So when I actually looked at this time, I decided the transition color wasn't dark enough. So I added a bit more of the darker shade to it. As you can see, I've got a slightly darker tone now, which is much closer to each value. So it's more like 50-50. So, and the method for this, when I add this, rather than load the brush and wipe most of it off, I only put a very little bit of it on the tip of the brush. I want very little on the brush, and when I brush this on over those edges, I'm barely touching the model. It's very light touches. I'm just scraping the model with the paint, so very little comes off, but I make little stabby lines most of the time. Sometimes you can go straight along a line like I've done here, but I also vary the stroke a lot. See here, sometimes I go crosshatch and sometimes I go along the line. And what you see after a while is you see that really nice blurring in between the highlight and the colour. And one thing about this method compared to the previous method is this method can actually be quicker on certain layers, and there's a bit of a caveat there. But if you get this right, if you've got good brush control and you can do these little lines very accurately and very carefully, you can get the transition done really quite quickly. It doesn't take too much effort at all. But because you've got slightly thicker paint, if you get one bit wrong, then it'll show. So then you have to go back with the previous color and take it out again. And as I explained earlier, what I tend to do with this method is usually I make the highlight bigger because I'm going to reduce the highlight. And as you can see here, as I paint more and more, the highlight actually gets smaller. Whereas the previous method I showed you, the highlight gets bigger. So that's the major difference between these two methods. I guess you could almost do a mix of the two methods. You could use the saddle brown and a slight glaze and do this sort of jagged motion, but I don't think it would work well as just straight glazing like I did earlier. Right, so we've done some fairly easy steps in transition here, so we're going to take a big step now. So I'm going to go straight to beige red now, just to try and show you the difference when you make a big step in colour value. As you can see, the beige red is really a lot lighter than the colours underneath. So we'll see how this blends in and the differences that I have to do to blend it. It's more noticeable to see it on the additive method that you'll see the bigger change, I think, here. And when I paint the highlight on the subtractive method, I probably painted the highlight too small, which you'll see. But you can still see the blending method that I'm using. Right, so blend in with the additive method. So I've got my beige red, I've added some water, and this is the sort of consistency and the dilution of the paint. So we're going to start blending this in, and this will take longer to do than the previous steps. Because as you can see, as I apply the glaze, it's going to take a lot of thin paint to cover that lighter value. I think anything can be glazed in and used to transition, but as I explained earlier, if it's a higher jump in value, it will take more glazes. It starts to show though fairly quick. You can see already on that upper part of the leg that it's starting to blend. It's just that it takes a lot longer to get it fully blended, which means you're adding more paint and spreading that highlight out a little bit more. So you do have to be careful to paint the highlights a lot smaller doing it this way. So one of the disadvantages of this method is what I said earlier, is that we can lose the mid-tone and lose colour. So what I've done here is I've mixed up deep brown now and made a glaze of that. And I'm going to glaze this away from that highlight now to try and add some of that mid-tone back in. So what I find with this method sometimes is that it goes a bit sort of pasty and a bit sort of monochromatic almost. So I quite often have to go back in with a previous colour or a mid-tone and glaze that colour back in. onto the subtractive method again now, guys. So I've mixed up a 50-50 mix of saddle brown and beige red. And the same as before, I'm just taking little bits of paint on the tip of the brush, and I'm now going to just work along the edges of that highlight area and try and blend it and smooth it in the best I can. This will sort of have a bit of the same effect in a way that you sometimes look at it afterwards and think it doesn't look quite right, and you may need to go back to a previous colour and blend the edges of what you've just blended in, or to a lighter colour and blend the inside of the highlight area in. But there is a bit of back and forth with both of these methods. And what I do later is I do actually combine the methods on this bit especially to do some glazing. So both methods can be used on their own or together. And as I explained earlier, I now felt that the colour was lacking something, so I've gone back to deep brown now, and I'm now going to try and blend in what I've just blended into the previous layers. So there's a little bit of back and forth here, but the end result is all that counts, and whatever you have to do is what matters. This again, it's the same technique, I'm just a little bit further away from the highlight this time. And here again, I'm mixing up a slightly darker colour now, and I'm then going to use that for the even darker parts now to try and blend those in a bit better. This is a very controlled method of doing things, and you can really put paint where you want paint to be and get the colours just right. So with the subtractive method, I'm now going to try and smooth it a little bit more by using the glazing method. So I've already got the blend there, but I just felt like it needed a little bit more smoothing, which I couldn't quite get with the brush. So I'm returning to the additive method now with a very thin glaze. This is thinner than the glaze I used for blending earlier. And I'm literally just pushing the paint into that highlight and trying to smooth it out. Like I said earlier, you can combine these methods, you can do it any way you like, but I quite often find this, that glazing, especially thin glazes over an area, is the last step I'll normally do, just for the final bit of smoothing. I'm not really adding hardly any colour here. The glaze is very thin, it's very watery, and after a few layers you do see a nice smoothing effect on the paintwork. Right at the end now, and I'll show you in just a second the final results, and you can see that both methods have produced really nice smooth transitions, and we've got quite nice lightish highlights, and we've still kept the really dark deep shadows. So I'll show you those just here, look. So this top area has turned out really nice and smooth, and you can see the leg there as well, which is also very smooth as well, and nice transitions. Thanks for watching, guys, and join me next time for another Brushmaster video.